For today's shipwreck video, we'll be looking at a particularly famous wreck, one that I've been holding off on covering until I could dig up enough material. Considering the context of this wreck, the lack of material isn't very surprising. However, I think I've gathered enough to give a good look at the wreck of USS Scorpion. This video will largely focus on the wreck itself and won't go into detail on her sinking. Instead, we'll just briefly touch on the sinking and discovery of the wreck before turning to the wreck site itself. So, with that disclaimer done, let's start with the sinking. USS Scorpion vanished on May 22nd, 1968. At the time, the boat was sailing home from a deployment into the Mediterranean. She performed a short stopover in Spain where 2 crewmen and some messages were dropped off. 99 men remained aboard as Scorpion departed on May 16, 1968. In theory, she was heading straight home. In practice, the boat was actually assigned on May 20th to stock Soviet shipping in the Atlantic. This eventually brought her to 250 miles southwest of the Azores on May 21st, at which point Scorpion sent off a status report with the sub estimating an arrival in Norfolk by May 27th. This never happened. The boat went out of contact and sank on May 22nd. Scorpion sank beyond her crush depth, with the central operations compartment imploding in the process. This detached the boat's sail, which ended up landing on its port side while the bow skidded on impact with the bottom. The torpedo room, including 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, remained intact. Meanwhile, the aft section of the boat was crushed in, with the engine room pushed forward about 50 feet into the hull. As well as this damage, the boat's propulsion shaft broke loose and fell away from the rest of the wreckage. We'll be seeing that later. By the time Scorpion's wreckage reached the bottom, at a depth of 3,000 meters or 9,800 feet, she had long since broken into pieces. The destruction so violent that the crew likely never even felt it, it was so sudden. This is not to say it wasn't absolutely terrifying aboard the boat as she sank ever closer to her crush depth. I shudder to think about what those 99 men went through in their final moments. That said, Scorpion's wreck would be located relatively quickly after her sinking. The boat was found by the research ship Mizar with a team led by John Craven, using information provided by Gordon Hamilton, who operated a listening station in the Canary Islands, which heard Scorpion's implosion. Exactly how Scorpion sank and imploded remains a topic of debate. Anything from faulty torpedoes to Soviet attacks to the prop shaft detaching, possibly due to a circle-running torpedo. None of these have been conclusively proven, and this is not the video to go in depth on those. One day, I do intend to do a proper video on Scorpion, her history, and her sinking. For now, though, we'll move on to the wreck itself. This will follow the usual format I hold to in these videos. We'll start here with an apparent sketch of the debris field. There's 2 interesting things here. The overall condition of the wreck, based on the limited information in 1968, being 1. It shows the bow in pretty terrible shape, where the operations compartment imploded. The stern is in better shape, although if this is any indication, the telescoping of the engine room was very visible. That aside, the second part is the weirder bit. What the sketch identified as a body on the bottom, or the impression of a body at any rate. If this sketch is accurate, that certainly looks to be the case because of how the clothing ended up on the bottom. It's a bit hard to believe any body could have survived the implosion intact. On the other hand, I'm by no means an expert on that topic, so make of that what you will. If that was a body, I'm glad I'm not the one who had to see it in the initial survey, even if it was just the clothing by the time it was located. And with that out of the way, we can look at the wreck itself, starting here at the bow. These pictures don't show much detail, but that's to be expected. This was almost 10,000 feet down in 1968. I'm more impressed the pictures show as much as they do. Regardless, here we have the bow. The overall shape is still recognizable, but that's about it. There's an opening here that we'll see better in Ballard's images later. That is evidently the torpedo room hatch. You can also see a split in the outer plating here. Other than that, there's not much to say. Moving aft from here, we of course run out of hull. This is where the operations room disintegrated, leaving the sail to detach from the rest of the boat, where we can see it here on the bottom. This is resting on its port side with what looks like the periscope equipment here. Regardless, that sail looks mostly intact from this angle. That said, there's not a lot of wreckage here. It'll look worse later on. For now, we have a mosaic to look at. I've never been able to track down the individual pictures, although I imagine they're probably in the National Archives. No one has uploaded them online that I'm aware of, so we'll just use the mosaic, which is interesting enough in its own right. We have the periscope and electronics equipment more visible here, as well as the shape of the sail's top side. For the most part, moving down from there, the sail retains that shape. Actual damage from the sinking in this mosaic is fairly minimal. Even the door is still in place here. One thing that's interesting, though, is that missing part here. That will be something we return to with Ballard's survey. For now, we'll round off the initial 1968 survey with a couple smaller pieces. First, this one, showing the top of the hull further aft. It almost looks unreal, specifically with the cabling or rope in particular. That's certainly a result of these pictures pushing the edge of available technology in 1968. In any case, that cabling is resting atop the stowage bay for the messenger buoy, which has remained sealed despite the force of the implosion, something you can see evidence of with the crushed snorkel piping as well as the cable, or again rope, coming out from its opening. As for the shapes between the two bits, the rectangular parts are access hatches into the hull, while the round parts are ballast tank vents. The kind of thing you normally wouldn't be able to see in any detail, but with the damage the boat suffered, I'm not surprised they're more visible here. Now for the last picture from the original survey, or the last one with any detail that I've found. This is a piece of debris that's torn and broken, specifically a damaged section of the snorkel exhaust piping, with the very notable rectangles being zinc plates intended to help manage corrosion. There's not much else to say here other than the tearing in the metal being a good indication of the force of the sinking. So let's swap to the second survey. Well, the second one to have pictures released. The Navy periodically checks the wreck to make sure there's no radiation leaking. The second survey, meanwhile, was something that became more famous in later years. This came in 1985 when Robert Ballard took down the submersible Alvin to survey the site. That survey is famous for two reasons: the pictures that came out of it, as well as the fact the Navy agreed to allow Ballard use of Alvin to find Titanic later that year. As could be expected, Ballard surveyed a wreck that was in more or less the same condition she had been in 17 years earlier. On the other hand, he did have better cameras and took pictures of areas the original survey either didn't photograph or never released. We'll get to that, but first we'll start with the bow again. This is more or less the same as the first picture from the other survey, just with better quality. That allows for seeing the torpedo hatch better, for example, as well as the other openings around it, including what looks to be the forward messenger buoy. For context, the top here is the tip of the bow, while the bottom is toward the break. There's not a lot of detail, however, and the same applies to the actual break. At least that's what I assume this shows. It's part of the bow and would fit with that area. The rippling of the steel does a very good job of demonstrating the force of that implosion, even here where the hull is relatively intact. I'm not sure what the piping here used to be, but that is bent and twisted as well. I'm also not sure why these pictures are labeled 1986 when everything I've read puts the survey in 1985. In any event, the next picture moves further back to the sail. Remember what I mentioned about the missing piece on the mosaic? That part was missing entirely. Where the sail was torn free during the implosion, it was heavily damaged. Twisted metal here beneath the dive planes, and an entire chunk torn out of the sail further back. This is further demonstration of the violence in an implosion, and that's not even touching on closer looks at the sail, such as the periscope bent up here, or here at the bottom of the sail where there's nothing but twisted debris. It's a lot of very clear, very visible damage. That's not quite as apparent in the next picture, which is a return to the messenger buoy storage. The hatch collapsed at some point in the intervening years, with the rope or cabling looking more like rope here falling inside. There's also an opening here with the pressure hole splitting a bit further down. It's not pretty by any stretch of the imagination, which also applies to the next two photos of the stern, where you can see the aft dive planes. These were crushed by the pressure as Scorpion sank, showing the internal framing and ribbing in stark detail. Even though the stern is more intact than the bow, that's not to say there's no damage. There's even a bit of tearing in the hull itself here, with the shaft missing entirely. You can also see the reported telescoping further ahead. And yet, despite that, you can still make out the depth markings on the rudder. The second picture is in the same area, but a different angle, where you can see the dive plane separating at the joint, and a better look at the crumpling of the skin, along with the telescoping of the hull. A third picture, meanwhile, gives us our best look at the stern overall. The crumpling of the dive plane isn't quite as visible, though you can still make it out, as well as the depth markings. But what this shows the best by far is the telescoping. You can clearly see where the stern is pushed forward into the hull. A very good indicator of the pressures involved. That also mostly wraps things up, with the final pictures being the shaft and prop, sitting here alone in the bottom where they broke off and buried themselves in the mud. There's not much else to say, really. It's another reminder of how bad the sinking was. But there's nothing else to note here. There's also an old video on YouTube that has footage of Ballard's survey, which I'll link in the description. Unfortunately, the footage is grainy and jumpy and doesn't show much that the pictures didn't, aside from some closer looks at the sail and the hull in general. I'll still link it though, because it's another look at this wreck and a reminder of the loss. Scorpion's sinking was a tragedy from start to finish. 99 men went down with their submarine in one of the most horrific ways possible, no matter what theory you accept for the sinking. And as we look at the remnants of the boat, either in 1968 or 1985, that's something worth remembering. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.